The system where the principles of property law are applied to man, mer and beast folk has existed as far back as the Merithic era. Slavery has a very long history in Tamriel, and wherever this barbaric practice is found, resistance, civil war or rebellion aren't far behind. One such event where slavery was at the heart of the spark that ignited an uprising would change the future of not only the province it took place in, but the entire continent, and perhaps even the world. The spark that would lead such a rebellion was a female slave that would become a leader of men, empress of an empire, and a saint. That slave's name was Al-Esh, also known as Paravan, but more commonly referred to as Alessia. Hello everyone, I am RedBeakRaven, and welcome to the story of Alessia. So sit back and relax, watch and or listen, as we dive into the story of the Nedic woman that founded the first Cyrodilic Empire. Before the Imperial Empire, before Cyrodiil became known as the Imperial Province, many of Tamriel's lands were under Mer rulership. During the Merithic era, Cyrodiil was ruled by a race of elves known as the Ayleids, one of the descendants of the Old Mer, an ancient race of Mer who supposedly relocated to the Somerset Isles from a mysterious continent called Aldmeris. The Old Mer that travelled to Cyrodiil and settled down in the province eventually became the Ayleids, who are also known as the Wild Elves or Heartland High Elves. It was here they established the first empire on the continent of Tamriel, and for many years the Wild Elf civilization thrived and their territory expanded. At the height of their power they occupied most of Cyrodilic as well as various parts of Valenwood, High Rock, Hammerfell and Black Marsh. But the Elven Empire, as strong and as thriving as it was in the Merithic era, would see its last days within the first 500 years of the next. The Ayleid Empire was not one that was ruled by one figure of authority such as an emperor, but by an alliance of kingdoms united under this one empire. Various Ayleid kings and presumably queens ruled their kingdoms and came together as a council of a sort to rule the vast territory their civilization occupied. The Ayleids are perceived as a race that was arrogant, cruel and whose lust for power knew no bounds. Before the end of the Merithic era, and although the Ayleids generally worshipped the Altmeri divines, the worship of Daedra spread throughout the Wild Elf society, and unlike others, there was no Daedra too evil for them to worship. Frequently making deals with the various Daedric lords for more power and armies of Daedra to use in order to conquer and enforce their rule, the Ayleid Empire dominated and enslaved the human population of Cyrodiil, who at the time were a race of men called the Needs, or the Nedic people. While the enslavement of the Needs was occasional at first, it soon became common practice for the Wild Elves to enslave any and all humans they came across. As they continued to subjugate the various Nedic tribes across Cyrodiil, they eventually found themselves in control of the entire province. For many generations, the Nedic people lived as slaves to the haughty Ayleids. However, thanks to the efforts of one enslaved Nedic woman, that would all change. An Ayleid slave, known to her followers as Alessia, had for all her life under the Ayleids' rule wished for nothing but her people's liberation. Not much is known about Alessia's early life, but it is commonly believed that as a slave for the Ayleids, she grew up in one of the Wild Elf settlements called Sard, which was later known as Sard of Ayleid, a place where to men, freedom was almost non-existent. Men were brought here from all over the Niben, some put to work in agriculture or construction, while others, less fortunate, were tortured for the amusement of their Ayleid lords. Lords such as the Fire King Hadhul, who was remembered as an incredibly cruel slave master whose victims were subjected to drugs that tormented their minds and whose child slaves were burnt alive for nighttime tiger sport. A small example of the cruelty the Ayleids had no problem displaying, cruelty which was inspired by that of which their Daedra patrons practiced. Much of Alessia's story isn't exactly straightforward if not unknown. Pieces of information regarding her life and the events surrounding it have been passed down over the years in legends and texts thousands of years old, thus more than likely bringing forth conflictions in the stories about her. At some point before the year 1E242, Alessia prayed to Akatosh and the Aedra, seeking their divine aid to free her people from the iron grip of the Daedra-loving Ayleids. Her prayers were indeed answered, for she received 3 visions from the Aedra. It's been said that it was at Sankator where these visions were granted to her, that it was there in that fortified city she received her divine inspiration for the rebellion that would soon follow. It's also been stated that it was there she founded her holy city. However, The origins of Sankhator are covered in myth, and Alessia's story of being there conflicts with the legend of how Raymond Cyrodiil, the founder of the Second Empire, came to be. As previously stated, it is widely believed that Alessia was raised inside of Ayleids, and there are no accounts that detail her moving to Sankhator. That is, of course, if the city existed at that time. It has been written that an Ayleid king known as Horemhir of Copper and Tea ruled Sankhator during the 3rd century of the First Era. If true and Alessia did indeed find herself there, it begs the question, was Alessia transferred to another Ayleid master, or did she escape from Sard and raise an army of slaves to take over the now ancient city? Regardless of where these events transpired, it would seem Alessia received the divine help she sought, as their 3rd vision came true when the infamous Pelennor Whitestrake wandered into her encampment covered in Ayleid blood. It is not known where exactly this encampment was, but it has been stated that it was somewhere in, and I quote, the jungles of Cyrodilic, despite the province being mostly a temperate climate. Before this, however, a Nordic demigod called Morihaus, who was supposedly sent by the Aedra, came to lend both his aid and advice to Alessia in her revolt. Apparently, Morihaus was a winged man-bull and is accredited with fathering the first Minotaur. It is also speculated that he was the spawn of Kinnereth, whom the Nords called Kine, and that it was her who sent the Nordic hero to Alessia. There are a fair few texts that point out this information, but as with all written history, we can never really know the truth. And so, with her 2 champions at her side, Morihaus rallying the slaves to her cause and Pelennor leading her army, Alessia and her people finally struck out at their former Ayleid masters in the year 1E242. The slaves were not alone in their fight against the elves. In fact, the recently established Kingdom of Skyrim sent some of their Nord armies south to aid the rebellion. On top of this, an unknown number of Ayleid lords also allied themselves with the so-called Slave Queen. Before the revolt, the Ayleids were in a period of civil war, due to rising conflicts between the Ayleid kingdoms. Disagreements that began in the first years of the new era and had festered for 2 centuries, causing the once mighty empire to be severely fractured. It is possible, if not most likely, that Alessia used this situation to her advantage, and so with the help of their allies, the rebels warred against the Ayleids. Many battles took place during this time, such as those at Seatar, Sador, Ninandava and Celadil, with Alessia's army victorious in almost every battle, destroying the Ayleid cities in their path. Pelennor Whitestrake is often credited for the destruction of various Ayleid settlements and the slaying of their lords. Whitestrake, while a competent commander and legendary fighter, did not become known only for his victories, but also the madness that claimed him. His brutal decimation of the Ayleid armies, along with the alleged stretches of homicidal insanity, earned him an infamous reputation. Before long, Alessia's forces controlled a large portion of the territory surrounding the river Niben. Their strategy was to drive the Ayleids inwards towards the centre of Cyrodiil, where the centre of the Wild Elf civilization stood tall on the horizon. At the centre of the now Imperial province lies an ancient structure built during the Merithic era known as White Gold Tower. Throughout the years, this Aldmer or Ayleid built tower has stood tall through countless events that put its very existence in danger. For many years to come, it would be a defining symbol of power for those that controlled it. It was here that Alessia's revolt would finally come to an end. But there was one powerful obstacle that stood in the way of victory, one particular Ayleid king that had the capacity to turn the tide of war, the Sorcerer King, Umoril the Unfeathered. Umoril led the Ayleid forces garrisoned at the citadel. In fact, it was late on in the war that he was given command of the Ayleid armies. Umoril was an intimidating foe, as he was of a divine bloodline, with his mother being an Ayleid, his father a divine. The Daedra worshipping Ayleids supposedly made a pact with the Aurorans of Meridia, thus the Daedra were used as foot soldiers to stand against the oncoming Alessian forces. However, the collective opposition was hesitant to attack. In light of this, Pelennor Whitestrake decided to storm the Elven Tower alone and face Umoril, who was one of the few that matched Pelennor's skill in battle. It is written that Umoril challenged Pelennor to single combat, likely entrapping him as should the Unfeathered fall, his blood would protect him from the clutches of death. But it was a trap nonetheless, for as Pelennor reached the tower, Umoril sent his soldiers soldiers to weaken the warrior, and it wasn't until after Pellinal was wounded that Ummaril finally engaged him. The two fought a desperate clash, but despite his injuries, Whitestrake was the victor. He slew the Sorcerer King, but barely survived the fight himself. As Ummaril fell, with his spirit escaping to oblivion, where he would remain until centuries later, Whitestrake was surrounded by the remaining Ayleid kings. They cut him into 8 pieces, and as Morrihouse along with the army entered the citadel, they found no Ayleids left to kill, except for the kings and Aurorans that began to flee. As they pressed on throughout the tower, Morrihouse found Whitestrake's head, the only thing the elf kings left as proof of what they had done. A manuscript recovered from the ruins of the Elysian Order's monastery at Lake Canalis tells us all this, and that possibly due to the nature of Whitestrake apparently being immortal, he was still able to speak to Morrihouse. However, what was said between the two is unknown. With the capture of White Gold Tower in 1E243, the Ayleids' reign over Cyrodiil was over. Alessia was victorious. She established a new Cyrodilic empire and declared herself the first empress of the Empire of Cyrodiil. As proof of her claim, Alessia was given the fabled Amulet of Kings by Akatosh. What is also disputable about this time is how and when the Amulet of Kings came to be. Kaim el Adabal, as it is also known, was, as far as the legends go, formed with the merging of a drop of blood that fell from the heart of Lorkhan and an Ayleid well it landed in. The magicka the well contained fused the blood into a strong red crystal, of which the Ayleids crafted into a magnificent gem. Some say it was simply a powerful Ayleid soul gem with no divine power having touched it before the covenant made between Akatosh and Alessia. Chronicles detail the amulet being given to Alessia once she prayed to Akatosh for aid in liberating the humans that suffered under their Ayleid masters. A quote from these chronicles reads, "Akatosh, looking with pity upon the plight of men, drew precious blood from his own heart, and blessed Saint Alessia with this blood of dragons, and made a covenant. So long as Alessia's generations were true to the dragon blood, Akatosh would endeavour to seal tight the gates of oblivion, and deny the armies of Daedra and undead to their enemies, the Daedra-loving Ayleids. In token of this covenant, Akatosh gave to Alessia and her descendants the Amulet of Kings, and the eternal dragonfires of the Imperial City." The latter sentence suggests that this covenant was formed after the Ayleids' defeat at White Gold Tower, which has led it to being widely believed that it was then when Alessia received the Amulet of Kings. Regardless, many now look to her as their empress and guide in this new world they had created. Imperial historians have considered Skyrim's intervention as mostly the reason the Slave Rebellion was successful. However, it is noted that Alessia received as much help from the rebel Ayleid lords during the siege of White Gold Tower. Although the fall of White Gold Tower marked the end of the war, the Ayleids were far from defeated. In what is called the Late Ayleid period, lasting from 1E243 to 1E498, initially there were many Ayleid lords that served the new regime as vassals. Some were even granted new lands taken from fallen enemies, and slavery in Cyrodiil could have still existed, as humans continued to dwell within the Ayleid cities, although under what terms is still to this day a mystery. Even though Ayleids continued to rule under the new empire, the relationship between them and the Elysians was an uneasy one, and eventually, thanks to the rise of the Elysian Order and their doctrines, the Wild Elves were pushed out of Cyrodiil, with many fleeing towards Valenwood and High Rock. With Alessia now empress of a new empire, one of the first challenges she faced was the creation of a new religion. She knew that it was crucial that she find common religious ground for her people and her Nordic allies. The Nords despised the Ayleid pantheon, and her people were not willing to cast the elven deities aside. Plus, the elves themselves hated Lorkhan, whom the Nords called Shor and mainly worshipped. Alessia needed to be careful in her attempt at establishing a state religion that would appease the various races, and so she made a clever compromise, which was merging the two religions together, opting to keep the worship of the less controversial Ayleid gods such as Akatosh, and bringing in the popular Nord ones such as Kain or Kinnereth. Lorkhan, however, who to the Cyrodilic people was known as Shazar, was not brought into this newfound religion. Rather, he was deemed as the missing sibling, a brother absent from Alessia's new pantheon, and that pantheon was the Divines. The Divines consisted of 8 deities: Akatosh, the chief deity; Arkay, the lord of the Wheel of Life; Dibella, goddess of beauty; Julianos, god of wisdom and logic; Kinnereth, goddess of the heavens, winds, elements and the unseen spirits of the air; Mara, goddess of love; Stendar, god of mercy, charity, justice, and well-earned luck. And finally, Zenithar, god of work and commerce. Together they are aptly named the Eight Divines. The worship of the Eight would go on to become the most prominent religion across most of Tamriel. Eventually, with the addition of Talos, the Eight would become the Nine. However, this change would be reverted at the end of the Great War in the Fourth Era. Aside the creation of a new religion, not much else is known about Alessia following the fall of White Gold Tower, save for the year she died and her successor to the throne. As she lay dying on her deathbed, it was then she became a saint. Some stories claim she was sainted by Shazar, while others claim it was Akatosh. Regardless, it was from that moment onwards that she would be forever known as Saint Alessia. The Empress died in 1E266 after a 23-year reign. Her son Belhazar would then take the mantle of Emperor. Ancient documents speak of a relationship between Alessia and Morihaus, stating that Belhazar was their child, and he is often labelled as the Man-Bull, suggesting some truth to the claims from some scholars that Belhazar was the first real Minotaur. It is said that Minotaurs were a symbol of the Alessian Empire, but as time went on they became perceived as nothing but savage beasts. With Morihaus often depicted as a demigod winged man-bull, it makes many wonder and even believe that Belhazar was indeed physically similar to his alleged father. However, this contradicts the general belief that any offspring of interracial matings take the appearance of the mother and possibly characteristics and traits of the father. But when magic or gods are involved, with Morihaus being a demigod, it's likely a different story altogether. And so with the death of Alessia, the Amulet of Kings and the task of lighting the Dragonfires went to her son and next emperor. For many years following this, the amulet would remain a symbol of an emperor's or empress's divine right to rule. It is said that upon Saint Alessia's and all her successors' coronation, or perhaps death, their souls were absorbed by this powerful stone, so that for as long as it exists, Cyrodiil's rulers could remain together in death. Eventually, at the end of the Third Era, with Martin Septim's sacrifice, the Amulet of Kings was no more. Its almost 4,000-year history came to an abrupt end. The Alessian Empire would continue on until its dissolution with the War of Righteousness over 2,000 years later in 1E2331. The establishment of this empire led to the creation of a popular yet controversial monotheistic religion called the Alessian Order, which gained control of the empire in 1E361. Their reign over Alessia's legacy is one that is remembered to have been cruel, full of foolishness and lack of entertainment. The Order is sometimes referred to as the Alessian Empire itself, as the influence they had at the height of their power was almost equal to that of the emperors. With the Order's downfall came the fall of the empire, and Tamriel was thrown into chaos. It wouldn't be until about 400 years later, when Raymond Cyrodiil established the Second Empire, that Tamriel would yet again know order and even peace. It was said that Alessia was buried in the catacombs beneath Saint-Quentin. However, it is also said that she was buried on the site where the Temple of the One in the Imperial City stands. The actual resting place of Saint Alessia is to this day unknown. As for her fellow Needs, the race would eventually become non-existent. Various events throughout the years caused the Nedic people's numbers to dwindle, and thanks to the arrival of the Regada in 1E808, Nedic culture finally met its end in the remote region of Craglorn in Hammerfell. Though the race no longer exists, modern-day Imperials have kept much of the Nedic culture alive, and even the Red Guards adopted some if not much of it. While Alessia sought to free her people from the iron hand of the Ayleids, slavery remained a continued practice throughout Tamriel. For thousands of years, and perhaps to this day, despite it being banned and discontinued in many provinces, slavery can be found all across the continent, predominantly in Morrowind, where many of the Dunmer consider the keeping of slaves an important part of their culture. Although, it has been said on occasion that towards the end of the Third Era, King Larlu Helseth of Morrowind banned the barbaric practice throughout the province. However, much like the Ayleids and the Needs, there is a long and dark history between the Argonians of Black Marsh and the Dark Elves that sought to enslave them. The implications of Alessia's actions continue to be felt even today. The Divines, though changed somewhat, remain the dominant religion across Tamriel. Men, mer and even beastfolk fight in the name of the Eight, or for some, the Nine. Many fight amongst themselves in order to save their traditions and religion. The province of Skyrim recently became a fractured land in a struggle caused by the religious beliefs of its people. Though no matter who or what people believe in, the horns of war ever continue to sound in the name of religion. Alessia's empire no doubt paved the way for the rise of both the Second and the Third Empire, with the Amulet of Kings and White Gold Tower taking their positions as symbols of power and right to rule. The imperial empires combined have for centuries shaped Tamriel in astonishing ways. They have proven that without a flag for the various races to rally behind, Tamriel may always be embroiled in war. While the Ayleids themselves are considered to be extinct, there are those that suggest they may still thrive deep in the forests of Cyrodiil, away from the eyes of civilization. There are also those that speak of fanatics who wish to see the Ayleid race rise once again, but talk of these fanatics hasn't been heard for over 200 years, and the last reported sightings of Ayleids are more than 1,000 years old. The last time Saint Alessia, or rather her spirit, was allegedly seen or heard of was in the days leading up to the birth of Raymond Cyrodiil. In the legend of Raymond's birth, King Hrol and his knights set out from the lands beyond Lost Twill, and eventually came across the spirit of Alessia, holding the dragonfire of Akatosh in one hand and the Amulet of Kings in the other. The spirit fled from the entourage of warriors, and eventually Hrol along with his shield thane found her. Saint Alessia then took the form of a hillock, to which Hrol impregnated and died from his labours. This is the last we hear of Saint Alessia herself, and although Hrol and Alessia's meeting is a legend, much of the saint's story itself is compromised of that which is still to this day debated on its truth. While the covenant between Akatosh and Alessia remained for the most part intact, it wasn't always the case. Tamriel has suffered greatly at the hands of the Daedra on occasions where the dragonfires were extinguished, but thanks to Martin Septim's sacrifice during the Oblivion Crisis, the covenant was rewritten. No longer would a certain individual be required to light the dragonfires and ensure that Tamriel would be safe from the never-ending armies of the Daedra. It's fascinating to think that an old yet powerful relic such as the Amulet of Kings has affected so many generations. Had Alessia not brought Akatosh into the equation, Tamriel could have very well been an entirely different place.